Everyone was stunned when the climber revealed he had found a real house built into the cliff. He decided to step inside, but just a few seconds later he realized it was a mistake. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and write in the comments where you're watching from. Mullock Johnson had never been a man of extravagance or endless distractions. At 34 years old, he had built a modest life for himself in the city, where office walls and computer screens dictated the rhythm of his days. Yet, beneath the surface of his orderly routine, beat the restless heart of a man who longed for something larger, something that could not be contained in cubicles or crowded streets. From the outside, his life might have looked ordinary: a steady job, a small but comfortable apartment, a circle of friends he met occasionally for dinner, or a game on television. But those who knew him well understood that Mullock's true self only came alive when he left the city behind and stood among the towering giants of stone and sky, the mountains. It had started in his late teens, when a group of college friends invited him on a weekend trip to the nearby range. At the time, he had thought it would be nothing more than a test of endurance, an outdoor adventure he could tell stories about later. He remembered struggling with the pack on his back, the ache in his thighs as they climbed, the sharp burn of cold air in his lungs, but he also remembered something else, an intoxicating sense of freedom that grew with every step away from paved roads and humming power lines. By the time he stood at the summit, his body trembling with exhaustion, he felt a new clarity sweep through him, a feeling he couldn't name, but knew he needed to chase again. From that day forward, the mountains became his sanctuary. No matter how busy his life became, no matter how heavy the burdens of work and responsibility pressed against him, he carved out time for them. The office where he worked, an architectural firm in the heart of the city, provided security and a steady paycheck, but it also drained him with its endless meetings and glowing screens. His colleagues sometimes wondered why he declined their invitations for weekend brunches or late-night bar crawls, but Mullock simply smiled and said he had other plans. He never explained in detail. He didn't need to. The pull of the peaks was something that could not be understood by those who had never stood alone on a ridge with the wind tearing at their jacket and the clouds drifting so close they seemed almost within reach. Every Saturday morning, long before the sun rose above the skyline, Mullock would be awake, moving quietly through his apartment, as though not to disturb the city still dreaming around him. He followed the same ritual with deliberate precision because ritual gave him comfort and focus. He laid out his gear the night before, inspecting each item with the practiced eye of someone who had learned, often through difficulty, that mistakes in the wilderness were rarely forgiven. A sturdy backpack rested on the kitchen table, its compartments filled with neatly organized supplies. Climbing ropes coiled tight, carabiners polished from use, a rolled map tucked into a waterproof sleeve, a compass, a hunting knife with a well-worn handle, packets of dried food, a lantern, and extra batteries. On the stove, he boiled water for his thermos, the smell of coffee seeping into the air as the city outside lay wrapped in silence. That morning felt no different at first. He moved from room to room, checking off the list in his mind. The boots, heavy and reliable, stood by the door, their laces already tied into neat loops. His jacket, thick enough to withstand the biting wind of the high altitudes, hung over the chair. Even the smallest items had their place: gloves in the left pocket, sunglasses in the right, a small journal tucked between 2 layers of clothing in case he felt like recording his thoughts during a break. When he finally stepped outside, the air was sharp with pre-dawn chill, the streets still slick from the night's dew. He climbed into his aging but dependable SUV, started the engine, and drove toward the mountains. The city slipped away behind him as lights grew sparse and the road narrowed, winding upward into darker silhouettes that loomed against the fading stars. Malik always loved this transition, the slow unspooling of the world he knew into something wilder, older, and untamed. He felt his body loosen, his thoughts quiet. The rhythm of the road beneath his tires matched the rhythm of his breathing, steady and calm. Ahead, the jagged outline of peaks emerged in the first pale glow of dawn, and the sight stirred a warmth in his chest. Every time he saw them, he felt as if he were coming home. By the time he reached the small parking area at the base of the trail, the sun was beginning to lift its golden face over the horizon. He stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply, the crisp mountain air filling his lungs. The familiar scents surrounded him, the sharp tang of pine, the earthy musk of damp soil, the faint sweetness of wildflowers that clung stubbornly to the edges of the path. He adjusted his backpack, secured the straps around his shoulders, and began the climb. At first, the trail wound gently through a forest, the ground soft beneath his boots, cushioned by years of fallen needles and leaves. The trees whispered as the wind brushed their branches, and here and there beams of sunlight broke through, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow. Malik walked steadily, his pace measured but strong. His body had long since adapted to these climbs, but he still respected the challenge. Each mountain had its moods, its dangers hidden behind beauty, and he never allowed himself to grow careless. As he ascended, the forest began to thin, giving way to rocky outcrops and patches of stubborn grass clinging to the slopes. The air grew cooler, sharper, and the world below seemed to recede, swallowed by distance. Malik paused at a bend in the trail and turned to look back. The valley stretched wide beneath him, bathed in soft morning light. Tiny houses clustered like toys near the river, and beyond them the city lay faint, almost ghostly in the haze. He felt a surge of quiet pride. Few people would ever see this view, not like this. Few would understand the way it made him feel small and infinite at the same time. He pressed on, his boots crunching against gravel, his hands occasionally brushing the cold surface of the rock for balance. The climb demanded effort, but Malik welcomed it. Each bead of sweat that slid down his temple, each burning breath in his chest reminded him he was alive. Up here, there were no emails, no deadlines, no shallow conversations that left him drained. There was only the mountain, vast and unyielding, and his will to move across its face. Hours passed in steady rhythm, and Malik lost himself in the motion. The sky turned brighter, the sun climbing higher, painting the ridges in sharp relief. A hawk wheeled overhead, its cry piercing the silence. He stopped briefly to drink from his flask, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, before continuing upward. The trail grew narrower now, hugging the cliffside, forcing him to focus on every step. He relished this concentration, this stripping away of unnecessary thought. In these moments, his mind was clean, his spirit unburdened. As he rounded another bend, he caught sight of a sheer wall of rock rising above him, dark and imposing. He studied it for a moment, recognizing the section of the mountain he had seen before in passing, but had never chosen to explore. Something about it drew him now, a subtle pull he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the way the morning light struck its surface, revealing shadows and shapes hidden in the stone. Or perhaps it was simply the urge, familiar to him, to leave the well-trodden path and discover something unseen by others. Whatever it was, Malik felt his heartbeat quicken with anticipation. He adjusted the straps of his backpack and set his eyes on the climb ahead. What he did not yet know was that this decision, so small in the moment, would lead him to a discovery unlike anything he had ever imagined. The mountain, vast and ancient, had secrets woven into its very bones, and Malik Johnson was about to stumble upon one of them. The mountain wall towered above Malik as if it were some immense curtain of stone drawn tightly against the sky. He stood still for a moment, letting his breathing steady after the climb, his eyes narrowing as he studied the surface. He had passed this section before on earlier hikes, but never so close, never with the light falling at this particular angle. Now, under the glow of the rising sun, the stone revealed details he could not ignore. Most of the mountain face was jagged and uneven, a patchwork of cracks and shadows. But there, slightly off to the right, something stood out. A shape that was too straight, too deliberate to be a trick of nature. At first, Malik tried to dismiss it. He had learned not to let his mind play games when he was out here alone. Rocks often formed strange patterns. Shadows shifted with the sun, turning cracks into faces or shapes that vanished as soon as he blinked. Yet this one remained. It was rectangular, its edges unnervingly precise. It almost looked like a doorway carved directly into the cliff, though he knew that couldn't be. His lips pressed together as he raised a hand to shield his eyes from the glare, studying the darker patch intently. It refused to blend back into randomness. He moved slowly along the trail to find a better angle, but the shape persisted, solid and unmoving. His chest tightened with a sense of unease. The rational part of him tried to insist that it was nothing more than a weathered slab, some ancient crack widened by time. But his gut told him something different. It wasn't just the lines, but the way they met at corners too sharp to be coincidence. The mountain had no reason to form geometry like this. Malik's curiosity, always simmering beneath his calm surface, flared brighter. He stood there, staring, while the wind whipped at his jacket and sent a scatter of pebbles rolling down the slope. He thought about turning back, about dismissing it as an illusion. Yet he knew himself too well. If he walked away now, the image would haunt him. He would spend nights staring at the ceiling, remembering the outline pressed against the rock, wondering what might be hidden behind it. His hikes were meant to be escapes, not invitations for restless questions to follow him home. The longer he looked, the more he realized how strangely positioned the shape was. From the valley below, no one would ever notice it. The angle of the cliffs and the shadow cast by the ridge made it invisible to the casual eye. Only someone climbing this precise path at this precise hour would see it at all. That secrecy unsettled him even more. It almost felt as if the mountain were keeping a secret, as if something had been deliberately concealed here, tucked away where only the most determined eyes might find it. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the small binoculars he carried for spotting distant trails and wildlife. Bringing them to his eyes, he adjusted the focus until the dark patch sharpened. His pulse quickened. What he saw through the lenses stripped away his last defenses of doubt. The lines were no accident. The outline of what appeared to be a roof jutted ever so slightly from the rock, its surface coated in dust and stones as though the mountain itself had tried to bury it. There were faint lines that might have been wooden beams hidden beneath years of weathering. Malik lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling despite himself. He whispered into the wind without meaning to, a low murmur only he could hear. "That's not natural." The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had crossed some invisible threshold. He could no longer pretend this was an ordinary hike. The mountain had shown him something unusual, something extraordinary, and he had to make a choice: ignore it and continue on his familiar trail, or find a way to reach it. He already knew what he would do. Curiosity was as much a part of him as the air he breathed. Malik stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. The path ahead was not meant for casual hikers. It was steep and dangerous, requiring careful handholds and steady balance. His eyes traced the possible route, the narrow ledges and broken rocks that led toward the strange outline. It was risky, but not impossible. He had the training, he had the equipment, and he had the determination. He thought briefly about the people back in the city who had no idea what was hidden up here. Offices filled with chatter, streets buzzing with cars, friends sipping coffee in warm cafes, all of them surrounded by their routines, never suspecting that high above them, embedded in a wall of stone, something mysterious lay waiting. That thought sent a thrill through him, a sense of stepping into a story larger than himself. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, and Malik felt as though the mountain itself were challenging him. Was he willing to risk the climb for the truth? The answer came swiftly, without hesitation. He had not devoted years of his life to exploring these wild places, just to turn away when they finally offered him something truly remarkable. He would climb. He would see what was there. He adjusted his backpack and tightened the straps across his chest. His gloved hands flexed as if preparing for the effort ahead. The rectangular shadow on the cliff seemed to watch him, silent and unmoving, as though it were waiting for him to make his move. Malik took a deep breath, steadying himself. He felt fear, yes, but also excitement, a raw pulse of energy that reminded him why he came here in the first place. As he stepped away from the main trail and toward the more treacherous route, his mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an old mining shack, abandoned and forgotten? A natural cave that someone had once tried to disguise? Or something older still, a relic of a time when people built shelters in the mountains for reasons long lost to history? The uncertainty filled him with anticipation. The ground shifted beneath his boots as he placed his first step onto the rocky incline. He knew this was no longer a simple hike. This was an investigation, a pursuit of a mystery that had chosen to reveal itself only to him. The mountain, vast and ancient, was offering him a glimpse of its hidden heart, and Malik Johnson was not the kind of man to turn away from such an invitation. With careful steps and the first stirrings of adrenaline in his veins, he began the climb toward the impossible shape, knowing that whatever waited there would change the meaning of this day forever. The first step off the main trail was like stepping into another world. Malik felt the shift immediately. The ground beneath his boots no longer packed earth but a loose scatter of rocks that shifted and clicked under his weight. The mountain seemed to narrow its focus on him as though the great mass of stone had been indifferent until now, but was suddenly aware of his presence, testing him with each movement. He leaned forward, hands brushing the rough surface for balance, and began to climb. The rectangular outline he had glimpsed from the trail loomed above him, its secretive geometry growing clearer with every upward glance. The slope was not forgiving. Malik had chosen dangerous routes before, but this one demanded every ounce of his concentration. Loose stones dislodged easily, tumbling away and vanishing into the dizzying drop below. He listened to them clatter against unseen ledges, the sound fading into silence, a reminder of what awaited him should he make even the smallest mistake. His breath came heavy but steady, and the muscles in his arms and legs burned as he pulled himself higher, searching for the next grip, the next place to anchor his foot. The wind strengthened as he rose, funneled through the cliffs like an invisible current determined to push him back. It tore at his jacket and tugged at his backpack, reminding him that he was nothing more than a fragile intruder clinging to the skin of something vast and ancient. He gritted his teeth and pressed on. Fear swirled in his chest, a constant companion, but beneath it was something stronger, a hunger that refused to let him stop. He had seen something impossible, something hidden where no eyes were meant to look, and now he could not rest until he touched it. Halfway up, he paused on a narrow outcropping, no wider than his boots, and leaned against the rock to steady his shaking legs. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his glove and glanced down. The valley stretched far below, softened by distance, the trees reduced to a blur of green, the river a glint of silver winding between them. The sight sent a wave of vertigo through him. He closed his eyes for a moment, pulling in slow, measured breaths, reminding himself that looking back could be as dangerous as looking down. His focus had to remain upward, always upward. He shifted his weight carefully, probing the rock above him with his hands. The surface was rough, fractured in places, but it offered just enough to grip. He wedged the toe of his boot into a narrow crack and pushed himself higher, muscles straining. A sharp edge scraped against his palm, and he felt the sting even through the glove. He ignored it, keeping his eyes on the dark, square shape above. It was closer now, close enough for him to see that it was no mere discoloration of stone. There were lines too straight, surfaces too smooth, and what looked disturbingly like the edge of a door recessed into the cliff face. The realization sent a thrill through him. Adrenaline surged, dulling the ache in his limbs and quickening his movements. He climbed faster, though still with care, his fingers searching out holds, his boots pressing into every shallow foothold the mountain granted him. The minutes stretched, each one thick with effort and danger, until his shoulders burned and his lungs demanded more air than the thin atmosphere seemed willing to give. Still, he pressed on, drawn by the pull of the secret above him. The climb grew steeper, the last stretch nearly vertical. Malik pulled the rope from his pack and secured it around a jutting stone, the knot practiced and sure from years of habit. He tested it with his weight, then leaned back into the harness, using it to take some of the pressure off his exhausted arms. Inch by inch, he worked his way upward, the edge of the rectangular shadow growing larger until it filled his vision. Dust and grit rained down as he pulled himself onto the final ledge, his chest heaving, his body trembling with the effort. When he finally stood upright, his boots planted on a narrow shelf carved into the mountain's face, he felt a rush of triumph. The path he had chosen had not defeated him. The mountain had tested his resolve, and he had not faltered. He leaned against the cool stone, catching his breath, and then turned to face the thing that had pulled him here. Up close, the structure was even more startling. The lines were not illusions. They were real. A roof slanted slightly downward, its surface coated in dust and scattered with small rocks, blending into the cliff so seamlessly that anyone below would never suspect its existence. The walls, though weathered, bore the unmistakable texture of wood, thick planks fitted tightly together, and there, in the center, was a door. It had no handle, no lock, only a simple wooden surface worn smooth by time. Malik stared, his heart pounding, every muscle still thrumming with the memory of the climb. For a long moment, he did not move. The sheer impossibility of it held him frozen. Who could have built such a thing in a place like this? The effort alone would have been monumental, hauling wood and tools up sheer cliffs, constructing a dwelling that defied both reason and gravity. And why? What purpose could it have served? Hidden away from every trail, every watchful eye, tucked into the side of a mountain where no one would think to look. The wind howled across the ledge, carrying with it the chill of higher altitudes, but Malik barely noticed. His gaze remained fixed on the hidden house, the secret that had drawn him upward with such force. He reached out a hand, brushing his fingers against the rough wood of the door. The texture was cold, splintered in places but solid. It resisted slightly beneath his touch, as though it had been waiting, untouched for years, for someone brave or foolish enough to seek it out. Behind him, the valley sprawled in silence, indifferent to his discovery. Ahead of him stood a mystery carved into the very bones of the mountain. Malik knew he had crossed into something beyond the ordinary. His climb had not been just a test of endurance or willpower. It had been a passage, a threshold he had stepped across. The mountain had hidden its secret for generations, but now it stood before him, silent and unyielding, waiting to be revealed. As Malik steadied his breath and let the trembling in his limbs subside, he realized that the hardest part of the climb was behind him. But the true journey, the unraveling of what this place was, who had built it, and why, was only beginning. The door loomed before him, mute and forbidden. A single barrier between him and answers buried deep in time. He had come this far, risked his safety, pushed himself beyond reason. There could be no turning back now. For a long while, Malik stood still on the narrow shelf, his body pressed against the rough wall of the mountain, his breath still uneven from the climb. The danger of the ascent still clung to his skin, sweat cooling beneath his jacket, muscles trembling from exertion. Yet, all of that was already retreating into the background, fading against the force of what now commanded his attention. He had reached the dark shape that had haunted his eyes from below, and what stretched before him was no illusion, no play of shadows or tricks of the mind. It was real, and its reality unsettled him more than any imagined form could have. The surface of the wall here was not pure stone. Blended seamlessly with the cliff was a structure so well hidden that he could hardly believe it existed. At first glance, the weathering of years had made it nearly indistinguishable from the rock surrounding it. But now, standing close, he could see the lines clearly. Wooden beams, darkened and hardened with age, were set into the stone, creating a facade that imitated the randomness of the mountain itself. Small stones and patches of moss clung to the roof that sloped downward into the rock, disguising its edges so perfectly that from even a short distance it would vanish into the crags. It was a shelter, a dwelling, a house built into the bones of the mountain itself. Malik pressed a hand against the wall, half expecting the wood to crumble at his touch, but it held firm, its surface cold and rough. Time had scarred it, splitting the grain into narrow cracks, but it was solid, stronger than he imagined anything could be after so many seasons of storms, snow, and wind. His eyes wandered to the narrow windows cut into the facade. They were small, no larger than the length of his hand, shuttered with panels so tight he could not see a single sliver of darkness beyond them. The shutters were covered in grit, but their shape was unmistakable, square and precise, like the eyes of a creature long since closed. And then his gaze fell upon the door. It was plain and unadorned, a slab of heavy wood recessed into the wall. No handle gleamed in the light, no lock protruded. It was as though whoever built this place wanted nothing to announce its presence. Malik stepped closer, his boots crunching against loose grit on the ledge, and felt the air shift as he moved into the shadow of the doorway. For a moment, he hesitated, his heart quickening, his instincts shouting at him that this was not meant to be discovered. Yet, curiosity was stronger than caution. The thought rippled through his mind. Who had built this place, and why? He tried to imagine the kind of person who would haul timber up this impossible climb, who would spend days carving a sanctuary into a cliff that defied all human sense of convenience. It was not the work of someone casual or careless. This was deliberate. This was hidden. And that made it all the more compelling. The wind swirled across the ledge, rattling against the wood, and for the briefest instant, Malik imagined he could hear whispers, as though the structure itself were breathing after so many years of silence. He shook the thought away. He had come this far, and now he had to know. Slowly, with deliberate care, he placed his hand on the door. The surface felt rough beneath his glove, the fibers splintered with age. He gave a gentle push, expecting resistance, perhaps even the stubborn refusal of something untouched for decades. To his surprise, it moved. The hinges creaked softly, a low moan swallowed quickly by the wind, and a thin line of darkness widened before him. He stood motionless, listening. No sound emerged from within. No rustle of life, no shifting of hidden occupants. Only the steady roar of the wind behind him, the quiet pulse of his own heartbeat in his ears. Gathering his courage, he leaned forward and pushed again. The door yielded, swinging inward, and the shadows of the interior stretched outward like the opening of a long-forgotten secret. Malik stepped inside. At once, the air changed. It was cooler here, thick with the scent of dust and something older, something that had settled into the wood and stone after years of abandonment. He paused to let his eyes adjust to the dimness. Slivers of light filtered weakly through cracks in the shutters, illuminating motes of dust that drifted slowly in the still air. The silence was profound, so deep that it felt like a weight pressing against his skin. His gaze wandered over the room. The space was small, little more than a single chamber, yet it bore the undeniable traces of habitation. Against one wall stood a bed, its wooden frame warped with age, a sagging mattress still clinging to it, though covered in dust and fragments of fabric that had once been blankets. A narrow table occupied the center of the room, its surface scarred by scratches and burns, a relic of countless meals or nights of labor. Shelves lined another wall, sagging slightly under the burden of their contents, metal cans dulled with rust, a lantern with glass clouded by grime, a scattering of small jars whose contents had long since dried into crusted remains. Malik walked deeper into the space, his boots stirring little swirls of dust from the floorboards. He reached out to touch the edge of the table, tracing its roughness, feeling the grooves where a knife had once cut or a tool had once rested. This had been lived in. Whoever had built this hidden refuge had not merely constructed it for a night or two. They had stayed here, perhaps for weeks, months, even years. On one of the shelves, beneath a layer of dust so thick it seemed to blanket time itself, Malik spotted a book. Its cover was thick, bound in worn leather, its edges curled and yellowed. He lifted it gently, feeling the weight of it in his hands, and brushed the surface clean with a careful motion. The pages crackled as he opened it. The writing inside was faded, the ink spread and fragile but still visible. Strange symbols and drawings filled the margins, maps of the mountains, sketches of routes, notes in a language he could not fully understand. His eyes caught on a date scrawled in one corner, 1916. He felt a chill, colder than the wind outside. This was no modern wanderer's notebook, no relic from a few decades ago. This book had been written more than a century earlier. The thought made the walls feel closer, the silence heavier, as though he had intruded not only into a room, but into another time. Malik replaced the book gently on the shelf and turned his eyes to the rest of the room. A coat hung from a peg near the door, its fabric stiff with dust but still intact, the outline of its stitching sharp even in the dim light. Near the bed, half hidden beneath it, he noticed the corner of a wooden box. Kneeling, he pulled it free and set it on the table. The lid creaked as he lifted it. Inside lay coins tarnished with age, their edges dulled but their forms unmistakable. Small tools lay beside them, a knife with a wooden handle, a compass whose needle still trembled faintly when he moved it. And folded neatly beneath these objects was a letter, its paper yellowed, its edges brittle. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar, Lupin letters that looked European, perhaps French, perhaps German. He could not read all of it, but he understood enough. Words of farewell, of longing, of separation. It was a goodbye. His chest tightened as he imagined the hand that had written it, the voice behind those words, the life that had once filled this room. Malik set the letter down, his thoughts a swirl of wonder and unease. This was more than a hidden shelter. It was a story buried in the mountain, a fragment of history preserved in wood and dust. Standing there, he felt as though he were intruding upon a secret deliberately hidden from the world, something meant to remain undiscovered. And yet, here he was, standing in the center of it, the only witness to its silent testimony. He rose and walked back to the doorway, looking out at the vast emptiness of the valley below. From here, no one could see this place. It was tucked so deeply into the stone that it might as well have been invisible, waiting only for the rare soul who dared climb high enough, who looked closely enough to find it. Malik's pulse still raced, his body humming with the adrenaline of discovery. He had come for another ordinary hike, but what he had found was beyond anything he had ever expected. The mountain had revealed a secret it had kept for more than 100 years, and Malik Johnson knew with a certainty that this moment would change him forever. Malik lingered at the threshold for a long moment, his eyes shifting from the valley stretched endlessly below to the dim chamber behind him. The thin light filtering through the cracks in the shutters revealed more than he had first seen, but it was still only a suggestion, a whisper of what this hidden place contained. His curiosity, already stirred by the letter and the old book he had glimpsed, now urged him deeper. The air in the house carried a weight to it, as though a century of silence had congealed within these walls, waiting to be disturbed. He stepped back inside, the floor creaking faintly beneath his boots, and felt the hush of the place settle over him like a cloak. The room was small, barely large enough to be considered a home, yet everything within it spoke of long use. Malik crouched near the bed, brushing his gloved hand across the warped wooden frame. The fabric of the mattress had rotted into shreds, releasing a puff of dust into the still air, but the form of it remained clear. Someone had slept here, not once or twice, but many times, returning after long days or long nights to rest in this corner of the mountain. He imagined a figure lying there, eyes closed, listening to the wind howl outside while the mountain's walls shielded them from the storm. The thought gave him a strange shiver of closeness, as though he were trespassing on someone's memory rather than their abandoned furniture. He rose and moved to the table at the center of the room. Its surface was marked by deep grooves, the scars of blades or tools pressed again and again over the years. A dark stain marred one corner, the shape of it long lost to time, but hinting at a life once lived here with all its mundane details. Malik traced the grooves with his fingertips, imagining meals prepared in silence, maps unfurled across the wood, or letters written by lantern light. Dust lay thick upon it, but beneath the dust was the ghost of utility, the evidence that this was no mere shelter hurriedly abandoned. It had been a home, however temporary, for someone. Turning toward the shelves, Malik's eyes moved carefully across their contents. The metal cans caught his attention first, their surfaces dulled and eaten by rust. He lifted one, turning it in his hand, the faded label illegible, the contents long since spoiled. He placed it back gently and studied the lantern next to it. The glass was clouded with grime, but when he tilted it, he could still hear the faint rattle of something inside. The wick, perhaps, dried and brittle with age. How many nights had this lamp burned, throwing its weak light across these walls? How many hours had someone sat here with only its glow to keep away the absolute darkness of the mountains? On the lower shelf lay jars filled with what once might have been herbs or dried food. The contents were now nothing more than shriveled fragments, but Malik leaned close, and for a fleeting moment he thought he detected the faint scent of something sharp, like sage or thyme, clinging stubbornly through the years. He felt a pang of awe at the persistence of even the smallest traces of life. He returned to the book he had found earlier, lifting it once more with both hands. The leather cover was cracked, the edges curling, yet the book remained solid. He opened it carefully, turning the fragile pages as though handling something sacred. The writing was a mixture of symbols and words, some of which he recognized as French, others in a script that puzzled him. Maps unfolded across the paper, detailed drawings of the mountain ridges marked with notes in the margins. Malik's eyes lingered on one particular page where a path was traced with heavy ink, leading not to the main trails, but deep into the wilderness where no modern hiker ventured. At the bottom of the page, a date leapt out at him, 1916. The weight of it struck him anew. This was not a cabin built by some eccentric recluse a few decades ago. It was far older, built in a time when the world was at war, when men vanished into remote places to hide or to survive. The thought pressed on Malik's chest, filling him with questions. Who had written these notes? Why had they chosen this remote place to live? And why had it been left untouched, preserved as though the mountain itself had conspired to protect it? He set the book down reverently and turned to the coat that still hung near the door. The fabric, though brittle, still held its shape, a heavy wool that must have once offered warmth against the bitter cold of these heights. Malik reached out and brushed it with his fingers. Dust scattered into the air, but beneath the decay the texture was firm. He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the figure who had hung it there, perhaps after a long day climbing the slopes, shoulders weary, hands numb from the cold. The coat remained as though waiting for its owner to return, a sentinel of absence. His attention drifted back to the wooden box he had uncovered. The objects inside, coins, tools, the compass, were like fragments of a life scattered across time. He lifted the compass and held it to the light. The needle still shivered faintly, aligning itself north. Despite the years, despite the isolation, it remained true to its purpose. Malik felt a strange kinship in that, a tool that had endured the weight of abandonment but still pointed forward, unyielding. The letter he had unfolded earlier lay on the table, and though much of the language eluded him, he returned to it again. The words he did understand spoke of farewell and longing, of a distance that could not be bridged. He tried to imagine the circumstances under which it was written. Was it a soldier forced into hiding, penning a last note to loved ones he would never see again? Was it a wanderer, choosing solitude but unable to silence the pull of the world he had left? The script seemed alive to him, a hand reaching across a century to remind him that history was not only made of battles and treaties, but of individuals who lived and ached and dreamed. Malik lowered the letter gently, his heart beating with the awareness that he had uncovered something profoundly human in this hidden chamber. It was no museum, no curated exhibit meant for visitors. It was raw, authentic, untouched by modern hands. Every detail, every fragment, carried the weight of authenticity, and he felt humbled by it. He moved to the corner of the room where the floorboards shifted slightly under his weight. Kneeling, he pressed against them and felt the faint give of hidden space. For a moment, he hesitated, his pulse quickening. Then he pried at the edge until a loose board lifted. Beneath it lay only darkness, but as he lowered his lantern and peered inside, he caught the glimmer of metal. Reaching in, he withdrew a small tin, its lid sealed tightly. He opened it carefully, and inside lay a handful of bullets, corroded but still recognizable. Malik stared at them, a chill crawling up his spine. Whoever had lived here had not merely sought peace. They had prepared for something darker, something threatening. The presence of ammunition in this hidden house spoke of fear, of danger, of a life lived under the shadow of pursuit. He replaced the tin and lowered the board back into place, rising slowly. His gaze swept the room once more, taking in the bed, the shelves, the table, the coat, the book, the letter. Each piece whispered fragments of a story, and though he did not yet know the whole, the outlines began to form in his mind. A man, or perhaps more than one, had built this place, hidden it where no one would think to look. They had lived here, eaten here, written here, perhaps even prepared to fight here. And then, at some point, they had left, leaving behind the traces of their existence as if frozen in the moment of departure. The silence pressed heavier on him now. He felt the weight of the mountain above and around, and the weight of time within. He was not merely a visitor here. He was the first witness in generations. It humbled him, but it also unsettled him, for the questions this place raised seemed larger than the answers he could ever hope to find. He stepped back to the doorway and leaned against the frame, staring out at the expanse of the valley. The sun had shifted higher, casting long shadows across the ridges, but from here, the cabin still vanished into the stone. Invisible, secret, preserved. Malik drew a long breath, the mountain air sharp in his lungs, and turned back inside once more. The house in the cliff had given him a glimpse of its interior, but he sensed that the truest secrets still lay hidden, waiting for him to look deeper, to connect the fragments of a story that time had tried to bury, but never fully erased. And, as the light dimmed in the chamber and his eyes roamed the silent walls, Malik felt an unmistakable certainty grow within him. The deeper he searched this place, the more he would uncover not just about whoever had lived here, but about himself, and about the strange, relentless way history lingered in places forgotten by the world. The dust from the loose floorboard still clung to Malik's gloves as he sat back at the table, the box of coins and the brittle letter laid out before him like offerings. The sense of unease had grown stronger since he had discovered the small cache of bullets hidden beneath the planks. Until then, the cabin had felt like a forgotten sanctuary, a relic of a man's solitude carved into stone. But the presence of ammunition spoke of something darker, of a fear that had pressed against these walls as surely as the mountain winds. Malik leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let his eyes wander slowly around the chamber once more. Every object seemed heavier now, imbued with meaning. The bed was no longer just a resting place. It might have been a refuge for someone listening for the approach of footsteps on the ledge outside. The coat was no longer just clothing. It was a shield against the cold nights spent in watchful silence. The lantern, the cans, the maps, all of it suddenly bore the aura of necessity, of a life lived in vigilance. He reached for the letter again, holding it carefully in the dim light. The script danced across the page in looping, steady lines, the ink faded but still legible in places. He traced each word he could recognize, filling in the gaps with guesses. "Adieu," one line began, a farewell written in a hand that trembled slightly toward the end of the page. Another fragment mentioned hiding and safe until spring, though the rest was lost to stains and time. Malik turned it over, but there was nothing on the back. He let it rest on the table again, his mind swirling with images of a man riding by the light of the lantern, his fingers cold, his heart heavy with the weight of exile. He rose and crossed the room to the shelves, crouching to examine the lower levels more carefully. The jars and cans seemed ordinary enough, but tucked behind a jar with a cracked lid, he found another folded slip of paper. This one was smaller, almost overlooked, and when he opened it, the ink was blotched as if the writer had pressed too hard or written in haste. The words were fragmented, written in both French and German, but he caught enough to piece together a story. Pursued, cannot go back. Winter is harsh. This place holds. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, filled with the urgency of someone who did not have the luxury of time. Malik sat back on his heels, the paper trembling slightly in his grip. Pursued. The word echoed in his mind, reverberating through the silence of the chamber. Whoever had built this cabin had not come here by choice of comfort or eccentricity. They had come to hide, to vanish into the folds of the mountain where no eyes could find them. The hidden construction, the disguised roof, the placement invisible from below, it all fit. This was not a cabin meant to be found. It was a refuge, a fortress against the world. He turned his attention to the book on the shelf once more, opening it to where the maps sprawled across the yellowed pages. He studied them closely, his finger tracing the lines that wound across ridges and valleys. These were not trails known to modern hikers. They led into remote parts of the range, places few dared to venture even now. And there, in the margin of one map, was a symbol he did not recognize, a simple cross etched in heavy strokes. Beneath it, in French, were the words "Le Sûr," a safe place. Malik frowned, his mind racing. Perhaps this cabin was only one of several such refuges, strung like beads across the mountain for someone who needed to move unseen. Closing the book carefully, he felt the weight of it settle in his hands, not just as an object, but as a record of survival. It struck him that he was holding not merely the possessions of some forgotten wanderer, but the evidence of a story that had unfolded here more than a century ago. The year 1916, written so clearly in its pages, was a reminder of the world beyond these mountains at that time, a world torn apart by war, by shifting borders and displaced lives. Perhaps the man who lived here was a deserter, a scout, or a refugee fleeing the chaos of a Europe that could no longer hold him. Malik's gaze drifted again to the wooden box. He opened it once more, lifting the small tools and the coins, turning them in his fingers. The coins were old, their inscriptions faint but not American. French, perhaps Belgian. The tools were simple but well cared for, as though their owner had known they were his lifeline in a place where no store or neighbor could provide replacements. The compass, with its trembling needle, seemed the most poignant of all. Even after 100 years, it still pointed north, steady and unwavering, while the man who had once relied on it had long since vanished into time. He closed the box and set it aside, the letter and the scrap of paper still on the table before him. His mind felt crowded with questions. Had the man who built this place survived the winter? Had he made it out of the mountains alive, or had he died here? His story sealed behind the wooden door until Malik stumbled upon it. The silence offered no answers. The cabin was empty, its occupant long gone, but the traces of his presence clung to every surface, refusing to fade. Malik moved toward the bed once more, crouching to examine the underside. He ran his hands along the frame, knocking lightly against the wood. It sounded hollow in places, and after a moment of searching, he found another small compartment carved into the beam. With effort, he pried it open. Inside lay a folded packet wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably well preserved. He pulled it free and carried it to the table, unwrapping it with careful fingers. Within lay another set of papers, these more legible than the first. His heart pounded as he spread them out. These were letters, too, though longer, and though much of the French and German still escaped him, he could make out phrases that made his breath catch. The border is closed. They search for me. This place is all I have. Another spoke of waiting for news, and if they find me, it is the end. Malik read them slowly, his mind straining to piece together the fragments, to imagine the life behind the words. He saw in them a man cut off from everything, isolated by necessity, clinging to survival in the harshest of places. He sat in silence after reading, the letters spread before him, the oilcloth still faintly smelling of wax and age. The story they told was incomplete, but it was enough to paint a portrait of fear, of resilience, of a man forced to vanish into the wilderness to escape something that hunted him. Malik felt the enormity of it pressing on him. He was not just standing in a forgotten cabin. He was standing in a monument to survival, a shrine to a human struggle swallowed by time. The air in the cabin grew colder as the sun shifted, the narrow beams of light through the shutters dimming. Malik realized he had been here for hours, lost in the exploration, in the piecing together of a life that was not his own. He rose and walked back to the doorway once more, looking out at the world below. The valley stretched endless and serene, the mountains wrapped in silence. From here, the cabin was invisible, its secrets safe. And yet Malik knew he carried them now, woven into his memory, imprinted on his soul. The thought that no one else had seen this in perhaps 100 years both exhilarated and burdened him. He felt a responsibility he could not yet name. To leave was to abandon the story once more to silence. To reveal it was to disturb the peace the builder had sought. He stood there, the weight of the decision pressing on him as firmly as the stone ledge beneath his feet. Behind him, the letters and the maps lay waiting, their voices whispering across time. Ahead of him lay the open sky, the path back down the mountain, and the world that had no idea what rested here. And in that moment, Malik felt himself caught between past and present, between silence and revelation, knowing that whichever choice he made, he would never again be the same man who had begun this hike. The weight of the mountain pressed more heavily upon Malik as he stood in the doorway, staring into the valley below. The air was sharp and biting at this height, rushing past him in restless gusts that tugged at his jacket and carried the scent of stone and pine. Yet, even the vastness of the view, the endless stretch of ridges and forests, seemed diminished compared to the quiet power of what lay behind him. The cabin had ceased to be just a room filled with dust and relics. It was a vessel, a keeper of someone's fears, hopes, and final words, and now those burdens had been laid bare before him. He drew a long breath, feeling it sting his lungs, and turned back inside. The letters remained on the table, spread out like fragile wings of paper. They seemed to watch him with a mute insistence, urging him to choose their fate. He sat down heavily on the bench, his fingers brushing the brittle edges once more. The words were faint and fragmented, but they carried the weight of a human voice, the voice of a man who had perhaps died with the mountain as his only witness. Malik felt the enormity of that solitude pressing on him. Whoever had lived here had fought to remain unseen, perhaps hiding from war, from persecution, or from justice itself. The truth was obscured, locked in half-phrases and fading ink, but one thing was certain. This house had not been built for comfort. It had been built for concealment, for survival at any cost. He leaned forward, resting his forehead briefly against his hand, and let the silence envelop him. His thoughts drifted toward the world below, the people going about their lives in ignorance of what was hidden high above them. He imagined historians poring over these letters, museums cataloging the book and the compass, experts debating the motives of the man who had once called this cabin his home. The story would not die then. It would be preserved, recorded, folded into the vast fabric of history. And yet, a part of Malik recoiled from that thought. There was something sacred in the secrecy of this place, something powerful about the fact that it had remained untouched for more than a century. To expose it might strip it of that aura, reducing it to an artifact rather than a living ghost. He stood abruptly and paced the small room, the floor groaning faintly beneath his boots. His eyes moved from the shelves to the bed to the coat still hanging silently on its peg. All of it seemed to ask him the same question. What will you do with us? He stopped near the window shutters and pressed a finger into the crack, prying them open slightly. A blade of sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the particles of dust swirling in the air like tiny golden sparks. For a moment, he felt the presence of the past more vividly than ever, as though the man who had once opened those shutters to look out at the mountains stood behind him. The decision was not simple. Malik had always respected the wilderness, treating it as something more than terrain to be conquered. It was alive, secretive, and deserving of reverence. This discovery felt like an extension of that respect. He could keep it to himself, let the cabin remain hidden, as its builder had intended. Yet another thought gnawed at him: silence would mean eventual loss. The wood would rot, the papers would crumble, and one day the mountain would reclaim it all completely. He had stumbled upon a piece of history, and with that came a responsibility not to let it vanish again. He sat once more at the table, his hands clasped tightly before him. He imagined the reaction of the rangers if he told them, the disbelief turning into awe, the slow machinery of research and preservation stirring into motion. He imagined himself standing by as experts cataloged the objects he had touched, voices chattering about value, context, and analysis. He was not sure he wanted that, but he could not deny that the world had a right to know. He had taken photographs, capturing each detail in case the mountain closed its fist around the secret once more. Perhaps those images could be his bridge between both paths, proof enough to awaken interest, but leaving the place itself as it was, untouched. His gaze fell on the compass again, resting beside the folded letter. The needle trembled faintly, always pointing north. Malik smiled faintly at the persistence of it. Even after 100 years, it had not wavered. Perhaps that was the answer for him as well. He needed to stay true to his own sense of purpose, to act not out of fear or hesitation, but out of conviction. And his conviction told him that this discovery was not his alone to keep. Slowly, deliberately, he began to gather the items he had disturbed. The book was returned to the shelf, the coat left hanging as it had been, the box slid back under the bed where he had found it. He left the letters on the table, spread gently as though still in use, unwilling to disturb their fragile arrangement. The cabin looked almost the same as when he had first entered, save for the fresh footprints on the dusty floorboards. He hoped, irrationally, that the ghost of the man who had once lived here might approve of the care he had taken. Malik stepped to the doorway again, his hand resting briefly on the frame. Behind him lay the silence of the past, heavy and eternal. Before him stretched the living world, bright and insistent. He crossed the threshold and let the door fall shut behind him with a muffled thud. The sound seemed to echo down the cliffs, as though the mountain itself were marking the moment. The descent was slower than his climb, his body weary from both exertion and discovery. Each foothold demanded care, each grip tested his resolve, yet his thoughts no longer lingered on the danger. They were filled with the images of the cabin, the book, the letter, the coat, the life etched into the very air of that chamber. By the time he'd reached the trail below, his legs shaking with fatigue, he knew his path was already chosen. When he finally stood on solid ground again, surrounded by the familiar trees and the whisper of the forest, Malik pulled the camera from his pack. He scrolled through the images he had taken, the facade of the hidden cabin, the shelves, the table, the fragile pages of the letters. Each photograph was a piece of evidence, a fragment of proof. He would take them to the rangers. He would tell them what he had found. The story would not vanish into silence again. And yet, as he began the long walk back toward the valley, Malik felt a deep quiet within him, a strange mixture of satisfaction and loss. He knew that what he had discovered was no longer his secret alone, and part of him mourned that. But another part, stronger, knew that this was how it must be. The man who had once lived in that cabin had written words meant for someone else, not for eternal silence. Malik had been the one to hear them, to read them, and now he would ensure that they were not forgotten. The sun dipped lower as he descended, casting the peaks in long shadows. Malik paused once on the trail, turning back to look at the cliffs high above. From here, as always, there was no sign of the hidden cabin. It was swallowed entirely by the rock, invisible to all but those who knew where to search. He smiled faintly, acknowledging the mountain's secret-keeping nature. It had guarded the story for over a century, and now, at last, it had chosen to share it. When he reached the base of the trail, the valley stretching open before him, Malik felt as though he carried more than just the weight of his pack. He carried a fragment of history, a whisper of a life lived in shadows, and the knowledge that even in the most remote and silent places the echoes of humanity endured. His hike had begun as any other, but it had ended as a passage into something greater, a reminder that the mountains were not only guardians of stone and sky, but also of the forgotten stories carved into their hidden heart. And as he walked onward, leaving the cliffs behind him, Malik felt both smaller and larger than he had ever felt before, humbled by what he had found and determined to honor it, knowing his life would never again be the same. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now so you never skip another unbelievable story. Check out the next video on your screen and dive into even more shocking discoveries. And if this story gave you chills, share it with your friends so they can experience it too.